Well, thank you, Sheila. Thank you for organising this and for inviting me. It's a great pleasure and honour to be asked to speak to you here today, and thank you all very much for coming. Now, it's been suggested to me that I might range far and wide. I think the initial blurb about the session did talk very much about the relationship between Britain and the EU after the vote, and I will talk about that, but it seems to me to be sensible to go back a bit in history and talk about some antecedent issues. So I'm going to start first of all by saying a bit about the EU's economic record. I will talk about where and when the EU went wrong, lessons from the euro. I'm going to say something about the UK's relationship with the EU if we stay in, effects on the city if we vote to leave, and the effects on the EU if we vote to leave, before saying a few words about what sort of Europe we should want. Now, first of all, I'm going to start with the economic record because I find this is something that most British people aren't familiar with. I think a lot of British people suffer from what I call Ursprung durch Technik syndrome. That's to say 20 or 30 or 40 years of exposure to advertisements for various wonderful German products. They're under the impression that this is a failing country and everything that goes on across the water, with the exception of some things on the soft underbelly, is pretty good. The facts, of course, are really rather different. What happened after the EU was first formed was that it was a zone of tremendous economic success. It grew much faster than the UK. Overall, it did pretty well, although interestingly, actually, the exception here was not the EU, it was the UK. If you compare the EU with other industrialised countries or groups of countries around the world, you found that the EU really did no better. But anyway, it did well in absolute terms. And more recently, however, it's done pretty badly. Now, often people say, well, you can't expect it to do as well as the emerging markets, who've got all sorts of reasons why they've got to grow fast. But I'm not making that point. I'm comparing the economic record of the EU over the last 2 decades with industrialised countries, with America, with Canada, with Australia, with Britain inside the EU, with countries in Europe outside the EU, with smaller countries in Asia, just about anywhere in the world. The EU's record is not very good over the last 2 decades. Now, why is that? Well, more recently, it's, I think, mainly because of the euro, about which I'm going to say more in a moment. But there's something else. There's the overall trend and thrust of the EU's policy, which is towards excessive regulation and interference in pursuit of its goal of ever closer union. And then, of course, coming along now and moving into the future, although even I find it difficult to blame this on the EU bureaucracy, there's the EU's very poor demographics. I'd like to see a link, maybe Gerard can think of one, between the very low birth rates in the European Union and the European Union institutions, but I struggle. Anyway, for all these reasons, we're talking about a zone of comparative economic failure whose share of GDP in the world has fallen quite considerably and is set to go on falling. Now, with that as backdrop, let me move on to ask the question, when did things start to go wrong? In thinking about this, I'm reminded of a visit I paid in the dying, not quite days, but months of the Soviet Union. I went to one of these huge international institutes. They used to specialise in these things. You know, the Institute of North American Studies. It would be like a town in any other country, had its own, I kid you not, you know, massive canteens, car parks, everything, an enormous thing. And I was going to this with some feeling of dread to talk to the Director General, knowing as I did from previous experience, these people usually bang on for about an hour and not say anything of substance. So anyway, after he had made some introductory remarks, I said, when did things start to go wrong? And he said straight away, 1917. And I thought, crikey, the Soviet Union is changing. So, when did things start to go wrong? I'm tempted to say 1957, with the Treaty of Rome. And I think there is an awful lot in this, because it's in the Treaty of Rome, of course, their planes of Pikestaff is the ambition for formation of ever closer union. Moreover, although we hear repeated denials from all sorts of people of the objective of making a European superstate, or you hear people say things like, oh, the high watermark of federalism has been passed, no need to worry about that anymore, we all know there's no, that's all tosh. Nevertheless, the fact of the matter is that the founding fathers of the European Union believed in precisely that. They wanted to create a European superstate, and what's more, they wanted to do it as a project imposed by the European elites on the peoples below, who they did not trust. They didn't believe in democracy. They thought that this cadre of European philosopher kings knew best for the interests of European people. So you could say that it started to go wrong in 1957. Having said that, I think there were lots of things about the early EU that were good. And in my mind, there are two key points at which the EU takes a wrong turn. The first is the extension to the East, and the second is the formation of the euro. I'll deal with the euro in a moment. Now, in saying that things went wrong with the extension of membership to the East, I'm not trying to say at all that this was a mistake. It wasn't. In my view, it's the EU's greatest achievement. And I'm not one of those stripy-blazered, mad staring eyes type of Eurosceptic who thinks that the EU is, always has been, the incarnation of evil and can't do anything good for the world. On the contrary, I supported the EU in the early stages. I voted in the 75 referendum to stay in the EU, and I actually think extending membership to what I call the refugee countries from communism was a fantastic achievement. To set them a set of objectives, to qualify for membership, to keep them on the straight and narrow afterwards, to reabsorb them into the European mainstream. I think that was wonderful. So why am I identifying this as the first point at which things went wrong? Because no one at that point considered the idea that the fundamental nature of the Union had to be changed. The mistake was not extending membership to the former members of the communist bloc. The mistake was simultaneously not thinking you had to change and carrying on with the same concept of Europe, with the same institutions and the same objectives as you had earlier on, when essentially what you were trying to do was to reconstruct the Holy Roman Empire. That was a huge mistake, in my view. And from that stem many of Britain's difficulties. From that comes the problem with migration. Because in 1975 referendum, John Mills is here, and he was the agent for the Leave cause then. In my memory, this question of migration wasn't an issue then, because it was more balanced. And it was more balanced because the members of the EU, as it was then constituted, were roughly similar in culture and in levels of income per head. Extend the Union to the East, and you get this problem of substantial numbers of net migrants. And of course it's still an issue, this, because still the EU hasn't made up its mind about exactly what it is, or more appropriately, where its borders should be. We've already seen the EU cuddling up to Ukraine in a preliminary attempt at some sort of relationship which would probably have included full membership, possibly at some stage or other followed by the idea of membership of NATO. Can you wonder, given all that President Putin, for whom I have no apologies, responded exactly how he did? And then we've got Serbia and the other Balkan countries. Where will all this end? What is the concept? The concept of a state that functions with peoples who belong together. Why is there no thinking about this? Instead of which it seems to be rather like the words of that great patriotic song, wider still and wider shall thy bounds be set. The euro, the next monumental, really serious error, an unforced error. You didn't need to form a common currency in order to have free trade or even a single market. The various people keep arguing this, oh, it was necessary to complete the single market. Well, in North America, not a single market, NAFTA, no one's pretending that the absence of a single currency prevents proper free trade relations between the United States, Canada and Mexico, but in Europe apparently we had to go through all that. Of course, yet again, and this is the abiding story of the EU, it's really driven by politics, and principally the politics between France and Germany, and the terms under which President Mitterrand would be prepared to agree to the reunification of Germany. And yet again, a total misconception by the European political elite, and in particular, in this instance, the French political elite, of where success and power comes from. They were concerned to eliminate the Deutschmark. And in doing that, they thought, in some sense or other, they'd tie Germany down and diminish Germany's status and standing within Europe. Instead of which, of course, exactly the opposite happened. That's to say, without an exchange rate, but with the perennial German tendencies, the good tendencies, to keep costs down, to save a lot, and to export well, and to produce very good manufactured goods. What's the result of all this? There's massive current account surplus, which has, far from undermining Germany, actually increased its power within Europe. So the euro, an enormous error, an unforced error, and it's been an error in more ways than one. A lot of people think that it's impoverished the peripheral countries, and this is right, in my view. Greece is a serious case, but in many ways, I think one needs to direct one's attention to Italy, which has barely grown at all since the euro was formed. It's, of course, a much bigger economy with serious industries, and we've got horrible consequences for unemployment across the southern belt, Greece, Italy, Spain, and Portugal. Some of those countries staging some sort of recovery, but overall, not much of one. But another consequence of the euro has been in Germany. I think people concentrate too much. They certainly blame too much the peripheral countries, in my view. What has happened in Germany is that the age-old tendency of Germany to do these positive things I talked about has gone unchecked by the exchange rate. If we'd had the Deutschmark, completely opposite to all the ridiculous pseudo-wisdom of the French political elite, if we'd had the Deutschmark, or rather they'd had the Deutschmark, because I think we should have had it, then what would have happened is it would have gone up against the other currencies of Europe. That would have kept the weaker competitors in the game, including us. It would have attenuated the growth of German exports. It would have reduced the price of imports and boosted consumer real incomes, and it would have put pressure on the German authorities to expand domestic demand. Look at the facts of the level of German growth and its structure before the formation of the euro compared to after the formation of the euro. After the formation of the euro, there's very little growth in German real incomes, workers' real incomes, and there's not much growth in consumption. And the opposite is true before the formation of the euro. And the reason is the very thing that this project abolished. That's to say, the Deutschmark. Exchange rates really, really matter. Which brings me lastly on this topic of the euro to the whole question of Britain's non-membership of it and the debates that led up to that. I was actively involved in the campaign to keep Britain out of the euro, and I remember many of the debates, and I remember many of the debaters. I say remember, I don't have to remember, because they're in front of me most of the time when I'm debating this particular issue. They're the same people by and large, same institutions, same people. But I'm actually quite intrigued by why so many good people, in many cases good economists, good minds, why they got this wrong. They weren't stupid. What did they get wrong? I've thought about this a lot, and I think what they got wrong was perspective and balance. At the time, they were focused on the damaging effects of fluctuating exchange rates on business and all the costs that came from that. And they were strongly of the view, which they advocated, that if you got rid of those, if you like, you know, if you could compare the price of pizza in 18 different countries without access to having to use a calculator, you will unleash a wave of prosperity across Europe. Well, funnily enough, to those of us on the other side, this always seemed to be pretty small beer. We thought there were more important things about exchange rates and monetary policy, and dare I say it, so things proved. And this, I think, has got important lessons for the question that we have before us today, which I'll try to draw out in a moment. Now, moving on through my list of topics I said I would briefly address, I said I would say something about how we would stand in relation to the EU if we voted to remain. I do think this is a key issue, because things aren't going to stay the same. Our relationship has not been transformed or made safer by what the Prime Minister likes to call his renegotiation, so that we're now in a reformed EU. I don't agree with everything that Boris Johnson, the employer or former employer, at least the one member of the panel, says on everything, but he did, I think, say something of real value when he described what the Prime Minister had achieved as 2/3 of diddly squat. However, it did cause my firm, Capital Economics, and myself some considerable difficulty when, after this statement, we had more than one Asian client come on to us asking for a precise definition of diddly squat. The fact of the matter is, the fact of the matter is that in order to make the euro work, the countries in the eurozone are going to have to go on towards some form of much closer relationship involving fiscal union and political union, and that's going to leave Britain in a very awkward position. We're going to be isolated. Now, there are some various vacuous words that appeared in the Prime Minister's deal, and he did the best he could. I think actually perhaps has probably been a bit unkind to the Prime Minister. It's a bit better, actually, 2/3 of diddly squat, but not much. In the long term, I don't see how it's going to make sense to be in a grouping whose very raison d'etre is ever closer union and the formation of some sort of federal superstate, and then to be sitting half in, half out there saying, yeah, that very thing that you think's really important, well, we don't want that, thank you very much. I don't see how this long term is going to be feasible, and indeed, if we do stay in, then I think we will ultimately come under enormous pressure to join the euro. The city, which is of course Gerard's special subject, as it were, let me just say a few words about it, to tie up with what I said earlier on. I talked about comparing the price of pizza in 19 different countries, that's to say the transparency and the absence of fluctuating exchange rates and the confusion caused by that. I think people are obsessed about that, and lost sight of the much bigger issues towards about macro management and the role of exchange rates. Well, similarly, when it comes to the city, I think people are obsessed with passporting. Now, I don't want to deny that passporting is important. That's to say, the idea that if you're in the EU, your banks, and indeed banks from outside the EU, based in your country, can sell throughout the whole EU, can sell their product throughout the whole EU. And the suggestion is that we left overseas banks, Japanese banks, American banks, Swiss banks, European banks too, and British banks would have to move a substantial part of their operations, if not all of their operations, to the continent or to Dublin in order to be able to sell their products throughout the EU. That's the thing city people are focused on in this campaign that they think is so damaging. I think myself they're onto something, in the sense that if we do leave and we don't have passporting rights, I think there will be the loss of some business to the continent and Dublin. Our banks will have to comply with the regulations. As far as banking is concerned, I don't think a brass plate arrangement will be enough. Other sorts of financial services, it may well be enough. And accordingly, some jobs and some bits of business will move outside the UK. But, just as with the euro question, getting this right depends upon balance and perspective. How much business? And is this the only factor? Funnily enough, wonderful though it is, in my view, the city often isn't very good at balance and perspective. Now, you know, those nice people across the channel in Brussels and Frankfurt, they're not very keen on financial services. Actually, quite a lot of them on the Commission and in the European Parliament want to clamp down on them. There's a sort of prevailing idea among some people in the city that if we play ball and we're awfully nice to the EU and we vote to stay in, then they're going to be awfully nice to us. They're going to agree to bowl under arm. Well, sorry, that's actually not what it's like. They've got a very different agenda for financial services, and they've got a very different agenda for London. They possibly could compete away London's advantages. If we lost business to Frankfurt and Paris, they would welcome it. Now, the big issue here is not the regulations we currently see, it's the regulations that may come at us before too long, because they don't like us, they don't like London, and they don't like financial services. Now, this isn't just an act of pure imagination, because there's a proposal for a financial transactions tax, which is currently stuck in the regulatory long grass, but may at some point or other emerge. Now, how would London be then, do you think, if the likes of Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley and UBS, all the rest of it, had transferred all their operations to Frankfurt or to Paris? Paris, of course, being welcomed by Mr. Hollande's wonderful tax rates. Frankfurt extending its usual welcome of entertainment after 5:30. How would you, I'm going there by the way tomorrow, hope to escape with my life. How would you, if you're the manager of Goldman Sachs or whatever, look back on your decision because of passporting rights? That you transferred everything to Frankfurt or Paris? Well, it's not going to happen, is it? What these banks are going to do is they're going to do the bare minimum. They've got to comply with the regulations. They're going to do the bare minimum of transferring business to Frankfurt and Paris. And as much of their operations as possible, they're going to keep in London. Now, I said I would say something about the effect on the EU. I'm going to be pretty brief. I'm very much reminded of a film from the 1930s called The Lady Vanishes, a Hitchcock film. I'm going to say to you that I think the effect of Brexit on Britain may not be at all difficult, and we'll sail through it and do pretty well. I'm worried about the effect on them. And I'm reminded of The Lady Vanishes because there are a couple of chaps who are travelling, in those days it is chaps, travelling on the continent. And they come back via the boat train, as it was then, to Victoria Station. They want to know the cricket score, actually it's off. And they come across one of these news stands, and on it is chalked the big news. And the news is, fog in the channel, continent cut off. My attitude sounds a bit like that, I'm afraid. But I do think, actually, a Brexit could cause some serious difficulties for the EU. Difficulties on the budget. We contribute about 9% of the EU's budget. Difficulties on migration. After Germany, we're the second favourite home for migrants, both from the EU and from outside the EU. If we adopted a tighter policy, quite a few of those migrants would probably go into other countries. Difficult for the EU because of what would happen to popular movements in other EU countries, in France, in the Netherlands, in Sweden, possible attempts to get referenda in those countries. Pressure indeed, partly because of that, on the euro. We know that the Greek crisis has not gone away. I've certainly heard some people say that because of this worry about the effects on the rest of Europe, we should desist from a Brexit vote. It's our responsibility towards the rest of Europe not to cause these problems. I recognise that argument, and I have to say if I accepted the premise, I would accept the conclusion. But I have to say it's not the way I see things, because my perspective as someone immersed in European culture who wants to see Europe do well, my perspective is that the leading thing standing between Europe and success is the EU. So if a Brexit causes problems for the EU, on balance, I'm actually really rather pleased. It seems to me that this could set in train a series of events leading to the reform of the EU into the sort of relationship in Europe that we would be comfortable with. Now lastly, what is that? What is the sort of Europe that I would be comfortable with, and I suspect many people on our side, let's say the Leave side, would be comfortable with? Well, first of all, in my mind, it's not nothing. That's to say, it's not a return to atomistic nation-states just competing with each other and perhaps hating each other. That's not my vision of Europe. And I think there was a point at which the EU could have evolved into my vision of Europe if it had ditched all the ever closer union, the free movement of people, the political union, all this other stuff. The sort of Europe I would be happy with is a Europe of nation-states based around free trade, but more than that, also friendship and cooperation, and perhaps very close cooperation, even in fields like the environment and possibly even defence. But, and here I come to the rub, we thereby come up against, I think, a very important question: Turkey. I think Turkey is the litmus test, and in my book I say that Turkey, a very important strategic country, part European, part Asian, very, very important country. I think it's important that in our European association, Turkey must be in. Now, the question is, what is the form of European association that we would be comfortable to have Turkey in as a full member? And the answer surely is not the sort of European Union that we have. That's to say, with free movement of people, 80 million Turks having the right to live and work here, with ever closer union and the progress towards fiscal and political union with Turkey. You must be joking. That's the path that the EU has gone down. So it's got itself into this really difficult position, it seems to me. It either has to sort of keep Turkey hanging on and not delivering, which is actually very dangerous, or it brings Turkey in as a full member. Currently, of course, it's an associate member, and that is disastrous politically and culturally and socially, and will not be worn by the people of Europe. Heaven knows what consequences would follow. What's gone wrong here is not Turkey, it's the EU. It's the concept of Europe. We want and need a form of European association which will allow us to live comfortably with Turkey as a full member. Thank you very much.
Gerard Lyons, please, will you respond to Roger's analysis?
Yes.
Especially on the city.
Well, good afternoon. It's a great pleasure, great honour also to be here. When Sheila did ask me to respond to Roger, I asked her whether that was sensible, because I said I always agree with everything he says, and I have to disappoint you, it remains the case today. But let me just go through some things that I think are particularly important in the excellent analysis we've just heard. And in particular, the real takeaway is both the direction of travel and not being fit for purpose. The direction of travel of the European Union, I tend to call it like being like the Titanic, or indeed like trying to walk the wrong way on an escalator. It's what comes out from Roger's analysis is the fact that the EU is set on a path that it will not change regardless of whether we remain in, or indeed maybe regardless of whether we leave. The tendency often for the EU when it's hit by a problem is to focus on even more Europe. But maybe I'd like to highlight in particular some of the things I thought were very noteworthy from what Roger said. In particular, the need for perspective and balance. And that means, from what Roger was saying, the need to be both longer term as well as the near term in one's outlook. He talked about the success of the EU. Often when people talk about the success of the EU, they do pick out particular projects or particular areas. The environment, for instance, is often cited. What was very evident from Roger's comments was the fact that we need to look at the success in terms of a time period. Maybe he was overdoing it a bit by saying that 1957, the Treaty of Rome, everything went downward since then. But we have to remember when the UK last voted on the EU in 1975, it was seen, as Roger touched on, as providing an economic success story that we should try and emulate. But really what does come out is that in recent times, the EU's success story has gone out the window. It's become controlling, centralising, regulating, or indeed, as Roger said, interference in the pursuit of a goal. So I think the historical context shows that maybe the EU did have some success in the past, but it's no longer the success story that we should try and emulate or indeed tie ourselves to. Another key thing that came out from Roger's comments was politics and the elites, indeed putting the two together. I would stress that here in the United Kingdom we tend to primarily look at this issue from an economic and a financial perspective. But what was very evident from Roger's comments, and I would agree with wholeheartedly, is that in the other 27 countries of the EU, they look at this primarily from a political perspective, and they don't really have any plan B. He did touch on the fact that in some respects the customs union that the EU is still set on those German and French terms. One of our colleagues in Economist for Brexit, Patrick Mintford, very much focuses on this. He in particular talks about the fact that there is so much debate about customs deals or trade deals, people often overlook the fact that the European Union is a customs union. And the relevance of that for those people who aren't economists is that when one is taught economics at university, the two big evils are seen as hyperinflation and mass unemployment. But in the next list of evils are seen as includes customs unions, because customs unions are, by their very nature, anti the consumer. They're very protectionist. They protect certain areas. And indeed, in terms of when Roger said, where will it end? Certainly for the moment, it's not going to end in terms of any easing in terms of the protection at the centre of the customs union. Hence, farming, because of France, is at the core. And even though we've seen some reform in the EU in terms of the common agricultural policy, it still accounts for a massive amount of the EU budget, 39%, 30% directly, 9% indirectly. The other part of the customs union is German manufacturing was at the core, and hence the auto sector in the UK does face a tariff barrier if we were to leave. But the important point is the politics of the EU is intertwined with the economics, but it's very intertwined with the customs union. Roger then talked about the extension to the east, and I think that's a success, as he said, but it's like most things, you need to adapt and change, and the EU has not adapted and changed. Free movement of people, the reform. What's interesting is that it highlights a factor that came up last summer. When the Prime Minister started on his renegotiation, he did face an uphill battle, but he did at the beginning have many supporters across the EU. Not just some of the countries Roger mentioned in terms of Portugal or Sweden, Netherlands, but many of the Eastern European countries had felt let down. Their agricultural sectors have been undermined primarily by France and the CAP. Their industrial sectors were not able to compete given the lack of currency flexibility maybe, but were not able to compete given the competitive position of German manufacturing. Hence, in turn, they've seen an exodus of many of their high-skilled and indeed young people, and we have been a beneficiary of that. The euro, gosh, whatever happens next. One of the things that Roger didn't touch on, but I think is particularly important, is that people who opposed the euro, I would find it hard to think that any of them would really support the EU. But this was put to me last week when I was debating. Someone said, but they opposed the euro and they're now in favour of us remaining in the EU. But I said, that sounds like they've not really addressed the issue that they highlighted when they must have opposed the euro. Because anyone who opposed the euro opposed it largely on the basis that it was unstable or unstable, whatever. Unstable is probably the better word. It was a fundamentally rotten concept in economic terms. It was driven more by politics, the fact that Greece could be like Germany and one size fits all. But if it was so unstable then to deter us from joining, one cannot overlook the fact that at the core of the EU is the euro, and at the core of the EU, therefore, is an unstable economic system. So if you oppose the euro, then I think you very much have to think twice about the EU. Just to briefly, the other two comments that very much Roger touched on, if we remain and the impact on the EU. If we remain, I think the other thing I would say that Roger didn't really touch on, but I'm sure is in his book, trade deals. When I did analysis for the Mayor a couple of years ago, at the beginning, I had this view that because the EU is huge, it must be good for trade deals. Gosh, did I get a pushback when we had about 20 round tables with businesses from across London, and I just genuinely changed my mind. Most of them pointed out the fact, first, when it comes to EU trade deals, the EU is very slow. Britain is one of 28 countries. We're a service sector economy, and services do not figure in trade deals. And as a result, it was a pleasant surprise to find out that many different businesses across London felt that the EU had A, not achieved much, or indeed let them down, or indeed didn't really offer much for the UK when it came to trade deals. In terms of the city, I would stress that 17 years ago, the city's competition was seen as Amsterdam, Paris, and Frankfurt. Now the city's competition is New York, Singapore, Hong Kong. And I think we need to be thinking globally. The reason why financial sectors don't figure in trade deals is because financial sectors tend to congregate in those major financial centres across the globe. I do not think that the city will lose out, but there clearly will be transitional effects, as Roger touched on. And finally, the impact on the EU. Look, we all want the EU to do well, whether we're in it or not. But we should not think, as the media often implies, that this is some sort of Britain is on the outside of Europe. For a start, the EU is not Europe. And for a start, the EU will have to fundamentally change in some respects if we are not in it. And that probably means more Europe, but at the same time it does allow more people to think about the opportunities in terms of what I'd like to think we are going to be doing, which is in this room itself, thinking globally, South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, and indeed France as well. And I thought it was an excellent analysis by Roger, and I found it hard to think of things I could disagree with, so in the end I agreed with it. Thank you.
Thank you. Not sure really how to cap that. I mean, I think that Roger's introduction was fantastic. I'm very pleased, obviously, to be here with you, Sheila, and enjoy this lunchtime meeting. I just wanted to say that, from my perspective as an MP, I mean, my fellow panelists spoke very ably about the economics, and they also spoke very ably about, you know, the way forward, as it were. I'll probably talk a little bit more about politics in the brief time I have, and also a little bit about history, because that's my training, and that's one of the things I enjoy doing. Now, I think that what Roger said about the long view is absolutely fundamental to a discussion about this. And one of the things that has struck me, certainly when I was researching my book, War on Gold, was that the perspective of the Euro, the EU mandarins, the bureaucrats, is far longer term than anything that British politicians can muster. So if you look at the euro, let's look at that as an example. The first stirrings of the single currency were the publication of the Werner Report. Now, I hate to ask questions of my audience, but does anyone know which year the Werner Report was published? 1971. It was 1969. So the Werner Report, Pierre Werner, I think he was from Luxembourg, came up with this blueprint for a single currency. And that's the sort of perspective, and it was 30 years between the publication of the Werner Report in '69 and the launching of the currency as a kind of shadow currency in '99, and then 3 more years, 2002, there were actually notes and coins that people could use. So that was a 33-year process, and in between there was things like the snake, there was also the ERM, which we joined for a brief period of time. But I use this as an illustration to show the long-term thinking. I mean, these people are serious about their long-term projects. And we've never, ever in this country really taken them seriously, taken the European bureaucrats seriously about the end goal and the end destination that they want. And I have no doubt that there is a plan for the EU. And if you read the writings of people like Monet, if you read their successors, if you speak after a few glasses of beer to German or French politicians, there are still a core of them who are absolutely committed to a federal superstate. Now, we can think this is bananas, we can say it'll never happen, but I'm old enough to remember that people said the single currency would never happen. I mean, how ridiculous was that the Italians would get rid of their lira, the Germans would get rid of the Deutschmark? And if you consider how much of a leap that was for the Germans, I mean, after the devastation of World War II, the Deutschmark was very much probably the biggest symbol of German nationhood that they built since the Second World War. I mean, it was a currency which people had huge faith, and it sort of embodied the prestige of that country. And yet they jettisoned it. And it wasn't really a vote from the people, it was, as Roger suggested, top down. So I think before we consider questions about the EU, we've got to take very, very seriously the long-term stated ambitions of this project. Now, the other thing I would say, is in sort of as a corollary to that, is that it is a dynamic system. It's not something that's static. Because we're so short-term, we often think that, you know, the EU in 2016 is set in stone and it will never change. But of course, this is a dynamic system. It's always changing. It's always integrating. It's always trying to quote, you know, seek monsters to destroy. It's a dynamic force. And in many ways, it's a very ambitious and bold project. And the idea that in 2016, we can just draw a line and say, if we decide to stay in, that's it. It'll be exactly the same in 10 years or 15 years. I think it's completely naive. As Roger and Gerard have suggested, we will continually have these debates. We will continually be surprised at the nature of the ambition of some of the schemes. And I know people who work in the Commission, contemporaries of mine, university contemporaries of mine, who say, well, we haven't really done anything in 18 months because we want to wait and see what happens in the referendum, in the British referendum. And then once that is settled, and hopefully Britain, so they say, once Britain decides to stay in, we will have a whole new raft of reforms. I predicted that they would have a quota in terms of migrants. It seems perfectly sensible if you're at the centre of the EU to say we should redistribute the migrants on GDP per capita or GDP absolute terms. If you look, and it's no coincidence that the Germans picked up a figure of 1 million. I mean, if you think Germany is roughly a third of the EU GDP and that there are 3 million migrants, you can very easily, you don't need to be an Einstein to get to the figure of 1 million. And on that basis, we would take hundreds of thousands of migrants. But of course, they haven't said that. But that's clearly what's in the air. And what I would say, just talking about the actual campaign, in terms of the sort of gritty politics of it all, is there's no question in my mind that, and it's very interesting to contrast it with 1975, that any kind of idealistic appeal to the British people, positive arguments, aspiration, superstate, all these things can have a positive spin on them. But I think the people on the Remain side realise that they have no traction at all. People don't really believe it. They don't have a positive feeling towards the EU. So therefore, of necessity, anyone who is arguing in favour of Remain has to use negative arguments. They have to use what the Roman rhetoricians called ad baculum, force. Baculum is a stick, saying if you don't do this, terrible things are going to happen. And all the arguments in favour that we've heard of staying in the EU are those arguments, essentially of force, of bad, violent things that are going to happen. We've even had World War III. We'll have plunging house prices. We'll have huge loss of jobs. Terrible terrors will be unleashed if we vote to stay out. And actually, as a politician, my last word is that this makes perfect sense because, as I've said, that all the positive arguments have crumbled in their grasp and have been abandoned decades ago. I mean, the kind of heady, optimistic, positive view of the EU, if it ever existed in this country, went a long time ago. And it's striking to me that in this series of presentations, no one's actually mentioned the EEC, the European Economic Community, which is what we joined. Now, the EU as a term only arose in 1992. No one had heard of the EU before 1992, certainly not in this country. And that illustrates very neatly the kind of dynamic system that I've described. And what I would say finally is that I think that obviously the scare tactics, they can work. I mean, if you look at the politics of it, our party did very well in the last election. There was a genuine fear, I remember in my constituency, of a Labour SNP alliance. There was a genuine fear at the end of the independence vote in Scotland. And it's very much, I think, a third time lucky. That's what the Remain campaigners are hoping in respect of this vote. It'll be a campaign of fear. There will not be a positive view, I think, of the EU profit because no one really believes that in Britain. And it'll be a very interesting vote. So thank you very much.